Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Thinkin on as difficult and as important a subject as I can remember us ever discussing at a Tortoise Thinkin. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And tonight in the hour to come, we're going to try and discuss the question, can white debt ever be repaid? And I suspect that when it comes to slavery, Britain's history as regards slavery and the relationship between white people, black people, and the past, this is a subject which is going to be strewn with pain and, as a result, a good deal of hesitancy, right? A concern about misunderstanding or saying the wrong thing. But I hope that we can, in the spirit of a Thinkin, in the spirit of Tortoise's effort to come to a better understanding of things together, even if that might be through civilized disagreement, we will, in the course of the next hour, understand things a little better. And I suppose, in its simplest, what we're really trying to do is know our history better and then figure out what, if anything, we can do about it. Now, everyone will say to you that you come to these subjects with your own set of preferences and prejudices. I want to get mine out there beyond the obvious ones to a very specific one. Yes, it's not a coincidence that I'm talking to Thomas Harding. He's my cousin. So you'll see possibly a certain preference there from the start. Todd, thank you very much for doing this. It's great to see you. We're doing this because in many ways, this is a conversation which you would want to have had in any circumstances, given the thinking we held with David Olusoga and the discussions we had about Britain's avoidance of its history as regards slavery. Clearly, following the murder of George Floyd, clearly following what happened in Bristol, we're trying to understand that more directly. And we're delighted that Cleo Lake is here. Cleo, thank you very much for being with us. We're hoping you'll help us understand the specifics of Bristol, but also what that teaches us about what happened more broadly in the UK. And Robert Beckford, you come at this with a kind of fearsome set of angles to you, whether it's theological, political, historical, and I hope you'll bring all of that bearing to it. But we're prompted to this discussion by Thomas's new book, White Debt. And so in that context, it means two things, doesn't it, Thomas? It's about a specific history, the history of the Demerara Uprising, but also the consequences of it. And I wonder whether you could just do us a favor, because when you first talked about the book, I remember being really embarrassed by the fact that I had no idea about the Demerara Uprising. And I've seen in some of the kind of book reviews since, people have somehow assumed that we all knew about it. But I have to say, in my school history, in my university history, I was never taught about the Demerara Uprising. So do you want to start just by telling us what happened?
Sure, and thanks so much, James, for inviting me here tonight. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I mean, like you, I knew very little about British role of slavery in the Caribbean. I came to this because I was writing a book about my mother's family. This is not the family that we share. And their history is that they had a very large tobacco business in the 19th century. And they imported tobacco from Virginia, and almost certainly that tobacco would have come from plantations worked by enslaved people. And that came as a real surprise to me. I had no idea. I'd never been told this. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been writing stories about our mutual family, German Jews, about how they were forced to leave Germany, how their property was stolen from them, how members of our family died in the Holocaust. And I'd really thought of our family as the victims, in air quotes. And this was very different, of course. And as soon as I started reading about this history, I became very embarrassed about how little I knew. What I did know was more about the States and the southern plantations, gone with the wind, 12 years a slave. And the little that I knew was, when I was a kid, was more about William Wilberforce, how we were the great emancipators, you know. And then the history that I was reading about quickly changed it. And I really wanted to look for a story where I could understand Britain's role of slavery, but with the point of view of the enslaved at the core of that. And so I was looking at slave rebellions around the Caribbean. There was a few of them in North America as well. And then I came across this extraordinary story of Demerara from 1823. I'd only heard of Demerara as in Demerara sugar. And I had no idea that it was a colony. It's right on the north coast of South America, next to Venezuela. Today it's Guyana. And in 1823, in the summer of 1823, almost 200 years ago, more than 12,000 enslaved men and women rose up and tried to change their situation against the British colonists. And it became the largest uprising by enslaved people in the British Empire.
And by the way, I should just say to people, if some of the people here are old hands at Thinkins and will know that the idea is that, like an open news meeting, everyone weighs in. So please do put your thoughts as Thomas or Robert or Chloe is speaking in the chat, and I'll bring you in. But we really want to hear your points of view. So the idea of the thinking is not really questions as much as opinions. And even as Thomas is speaking, I see some of the people who even showed up in your book. Thomas, I see Kibwe Copeland is here, and a bunch of other people who are going to have things to say. So please do join in. And I'm going to come. I see already Robert Campbell's got his hand up. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Robert. But Thomas, you say almost apologetically, I didn't know the history of Demerara. Part of the point here is that it's not properly taught, is it? It doesn't feel to me as though, certainly it's part of the curriculum in the way in which the Amritsar massacre is part of our understanding of what British Empire meant in India. And if not, why not?
Well, exactly. And look, I'm very happy and pleased that the Holocaust is taught in British schools, in the state schools. Is mandatory as far as I understand it. But there's no obligation, similar obligation, when it comes to the history of slavery, Britain's role in slavery. And I think you have to ask why. And when I was in Guyana, I was very lucky to get to Guyana. And I should say that I received money from the German government as they call it, restitution, reparations, and I received this money, and that in itself is controversial in our family about whether you receive it or not, and there's a whole history of that. But when I was in Guyana, I had a few people say to me, well, if the Jews who were victims of the Holocaust receive money from reparations, why don't we, the descendants of those enslaved? And I have to say, I think that's a really fair point. And it speaks to this whole thing about how we're taught about Britain's role in slavery. Who gets to curate history? Who's actually written the history books? Why is it that there are films, so many films, I've seen the films, about what happened in North America, but very, very few about, I don't know how many, Amazing Grace, maybe Belle, but really nothing like 12 Years a Slave or any of those really key cultural moments, roots. And like you said at the beginning, when my book came out, there was quite a lot of pushback in some of the mainstream press. Laughing at me for not knowing this history. And look, I said I was embarrassed, and I understand why people might think, I should know more. But when I speak to people about this, most people don't know about this history either. And it seems to me there's a real need for this history to be taught.
Can I do, Thomas, I want to come back to you on the argument that you make for reparations. Sure. Because in some ways, I suppose actually the easiest bit of your book is we should know our history better. Who's going to argue with that, right? There's a question about how you do that, who runs the curriculum, but right. The idea and principle. The much more contentious issue is this question of reparations or restitution. And given that, if you've read White Debt, then forgive me, I'm telling you something you already know. If you haven't read it, the way in which Thomas does it is he tells the narrative history of the Demerara Uprising in a way that it's not been told before, because it's historically been told through the lens of a missionary as if you like, the hero figure. This time it's told in a much fuller way, but clearly with the abolitionist enslaved people. That's the language you use, Thomas. That those people who were on the Success Plantation themselves organizing the uprising. But you also then do this thing, as if you like, through the course of the book, where you examine the process of trying to tell that history, and it ends with a conversation between you and a man who I read in the book called Kibwe Copeland, but now I look at him on the screen, making the argument that reparations is unavoidable. So rather than putting you on the spot to make the case, Kibwe, why don't you just weigh in, and then I'm going to come to Robert and Chloe on this subject, and Robert Campbell, I'll come to you too. Kibwe, the book ends with your argument that reparations is unavoidable if you want to address a crime against humanity. So can you just make it for us, and then forgive me, I'm going to try and see whether or not we do or don't agree with that.
Yes, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. And indeed, Thomas spoke about history, and he spoke about, and you yourself spoke about history and not being privy to this particular part of history, even in your schooling, and even in Guyana, in the country itself, in Demerara, in the curriculum, there is not much that is being taught about the 1823 rebellion, Demerara rebellion, indeed. And that is because most of the educational system across the world, and because of Guyana being a colony or a former colony of British, the same systems and the same history teachings on what is most important to be taught in schools would have been passed down, inherited from Britain. So a lot of young people, a lot of people in general do not know about the 1823 rebellion, even being a part of the country where it all happened. So reparations basically speaks to repair, as I've always say, and we understand that there are several disparities that the world faces today. And we try to always look at present day, not paying attention to what would have caused these present day problems in the first place. When you go to the hospital or to the doctor, they'd always try to examine you. But besides the examination, they'd like to ask, what happened? What happened before? What brought you to the hospital? What were you eating? What was your diet like? And these kind of things. So there's always a long-term effect of things that you would have done in the past. And that is what we see today with slavery. Slavery, of course, the legacy of slavery would have passed on into the present day, whereby African people were stripped away from their culture, their knowledge of their morals, traditions, etc. And then they were placed on, what should I say, we call them free. You'd say we were freed, but freed with nothing to start with, whereby most of the world would have maintained their morals, maintained their way of life, and would have had more than 400 years kickstart, where African people were not given that opportunity. So we see this big disparity between African people and white people, whereby we are now trying to get a grips of ourselves, get a grips with with things in a particular way. And
can we apologies for interrupting. I just want to be clear that we all know what we're talking about. I think people will understand, if you like, the moral and historical arguments. What do you actually mean by reparations, right? What is it in financial terms or legal terms that you would like in terms of reparations?
All right, good. So when we speak about reparations, the whole conversation of money, what are we talking about? Are we talking about checks, as Thomas would have said, collecting checks, etc.? And it's not the same. Reparations in this case, and I like to follow the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. It's talking about putting money towards a fund that would help these main 10 points. We understand that giving people money is not going to change a problem directly to their hands. There are several problems that have been affected, that African people have been affected by, and we want a fund whereby things can be pushed towards psychological rehabilitation, funding towards making more opportunities for people of African descent to get higher education, funding towards persons who are, what should I say, being strapped for cash. We know that African people, there's always been that saying that African people have not been getting the same access as other races to get loans or to get capital. We even look at debt cancellations. There are many countries, we talk about Haiti, which had to pay how much money for their own freedom, even after fighting and winning a war against the Dutch. Debt cancellations, of course.
So Kibwe, this is a very important point, isn't it? Because people sometimes think that reparations is directly a check from one person to another. These are structural changes you're advocating, investment in education, debt cancellation, etc. All right, I'm just going to pause there if I might, Kibwe, because I just want to play to Cleo and to Robert, if I might, this conversation so far, and just ask them directly. Cleo Lake, I'm going to come to you first, if I might. I feel, for those people who don't know, Cleo was the Green Party's first, in fact, the first Green Party Lord Mayor of Bristol. And I imagine you've been discussing issues of culture and history as if it's a full-time job in the last year or so, Cleo. But where do you come out specifically on this question, not just of understanding our history, but of addressing it, of changing UK behaviour, and specifically this issue of reparations? Oh, excuse me, one second. Let me just double check that. I can't hear you. Cleo, can we just make sure that you're unmuted? One second.
I'm on mute.
Oh, got you. You're all there.
Good. Hopefully you can all hear me now. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Well, I think first of all, and you know, the world, UK, Bristol, and everywhere else is on a particular journey, which is, you know, developed and is, you know, the catalyst of which is speeding up as we talk now. But I think one of the major issues is, again, going back to the idea of lack of education and awareness of the full extent of history, you know, across many different demographics, really. And I think where that leads us to is a massive lack of empathy for what has happened to people of African descent. And, you know, that perhaps isn't the same for other people. So I think people being able to acknowledge, first of all, that enslavement and how it was done was extremely wrong. It was a crime against humanity. And I think that needs to be the starting point, really. And until people are willing to acknowledge that, regardless of how painful it might be in acknowledging that, then we're going to kind of go round in circles. So I think actually when we talk about reparations, first of all, it's an acknowledgement that harm was committed and that harm continues to be committed. And many campaigners actually would say that the first step is actually stopping the harm that continues to happen. That's the first part of repair. Reparations can't just be money and a payout. Having said that, wealth redistribution is something that I would definitely advocate, as well as land reparations and, you know, land reform to an extent. We are in an interesting place in Bristol, and we have actually passed a reparations motion at full council. One of the things that I was involved with before I finished my term as a local councillor. That is one of 3 that has taken place across the UK, and we do envision that there'll be more local councils passing reparations motions, which will both speak locally into some initiatives that will happen citywide, but also on a global scale as well. And I think a key point about reparations is also how we can, as people of African descent, reclaim and regain our sense of sovereignty, all of the things that were stripped away from us, and also recognise each other across the diaspora. So when we speak of reparations, it isn't just for people who are of African descent in the UK or Europe. It isn't just about people of African descent in the Caribbean or Americas. It is also about people on the continent of Africa and reuniting the diaspora.
Cleo, so just for one specific point, what's the Bristol programme then in terms of local reparations? What are you talking about?
There's 4 main points to the reparations motion that was passed, and I'm happy to post that in the chat for people to have a look through. Some of it is about wealth redistribution and finding ways or engineering ways to enable intergenerational wealth creation. So it's all of these things that people would not have been privileged to have had, as well as things like health and some of the things that you would expect, actually. So there are some steps being taken locally. Also, what's been important in Bristol, and we do have a legacy steering group that was formed before the statue was toppled to actually talk about these issues and how Bristol will acknowledge its past. And we've just released the report for something called Project Truth, which stands for Telling, Restoring, Understanding Our Tapestry and History, which was a consultation with African heritage communities in Bristol, because actually there'd never been the question formally asked to people of African heritage in the city about what they think should happen. So that was an incredibly important first step, and we've just got the results of that. And perhaps interestingly, to some of the focus group questions, most people thought that it was important that people who had profited and still hang on to that sense of intergenerational wealth, which can include acres of land in the UK and in the Caribbean and abroad, that there should be some accountability there.
Well, Cleo, thank you. I'm going to come back in a moment to Thomas on that, because that's one of the sort of central arguments of the book. But Robert Beckford, you've been nodding away, but as I said at the beginning, you come at this with a kind of unusual range, because as a sort of professor of theology, as the day job, this is one of those particular things that is deeply moral issue as well as an intensely practical one. So just tell us how you think about it. A, the teaching of history, the knowing of our history, and then the B, what do we do about it, the reparations?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for writing the book, Thomas. I think it was incredibly courageous and audacious to do within the British context. So I commend you for doing that. I'm having my students read it this semester, so hopefully I'll be able to give you some feedback on that. I'd just like to say three things. Firstly, look, in terms of the telling of history, Stuart Hall said this some time ago, there is a selective historical amnesia when it comes to telling British history. There's always been a lacuna when it comes to the slave and colonial past. And the reason for that, the second thing, is because it is a fundamental critique of everything that we hold dear as being British. It disrupts notions of British civility, it disrupts notions of British fair play, and it completely destroys ideas of British equality. And that's why we don't want to deal with it, because it dents the notion of white saviorism within Britain, which has been an integral part of our reconstruction of the history of empire, to somehow suggest that we gave it away. And somehow that was actually a noble activity. So that's what we don't want to deal with it, because of the terror and the emotional work that we'd have to do as a consequence. Third thing I'd say in terms of the history, which I think is important, is what Paul Gilroy says, that until we actually deal with it and mourn it, as he suggests, there will be this national psychological dysfunction, this post-colonial melancholia, as he calls it, this inability to reckon with the past. So we've got some deep emotional work to do to work through this history. Now, how do we deal with it? I want to see the check. Maybe it's my undergraduate American degree coming out and influencing me, working where, I'm spending too much time in New York with all these African Americans. But I think slavery was fundamentally economic. It began as economic. How do we develop these raw materials in this hot area? The Indians can't do it. We'll get the Africans. It was economic. Even when it ended, it was economic. It wasn't because Britain got a moral conscience. It was because by 1834, they recognized it was going to be cheaper to have these people work for low wages than trying to sustain the plantation system. And if you have a situation where it's economic injustice, you rectify that with economic justice. So I want to see the check. I know that reparations is multifaceted, it's holistic.
But you want, but the financial is
complex. But fundamentally, I'm saying, if you take this history seriously, and there is a moral case, it was unjust gain, crime against humanity, huge amounts of profit made on the backs of genocide, rape, torture. We haven't even talked about the paedophilia that was part of this process. So for me,
Robert, pause 1 second. Sorry. Okay, so I get the point. You want the check. Who's writing the check?
Well, I think there are three major institutions that should be writing the check. First of all, every single industry that made money out of this. So we've got to look at the banking system, for example. And we know, without giving away too much, there are major high street banks looking at this and doing the calculations at this point in time. But the shipping insurers, Lloyd's of London, who are now beginning to look at this. Other people who have gained money from it, Green King, for example, the royal family, who made a huge amount of money from the trade. So we should be going after every single institution, every organization, every individual,
directly
every family who made profit from this.
Okay, Robert, I'm gonna let me, if I might, I'm just gonna bring in Robert Campbell, who's got their hands up, and I see that Akayemi Claude Garnett got his hand up too. Thomas, before I come to you, let me hear from Robert, if I might. Campbell.
Hi, good evening. Although I came into the chat basically to try and talk about the issues of the difference between India and the Americas and the Caribbean. Just one comment on what the previous speaker has just said about wanting a check. There are people who still own vast tracts of land, and some in our Houses of Parliament and in the Lords, who own plantations still out there from way back when. And I just wonder whether they should be specifically targeted for that reparation check. But one of the things I wanted to say was about the difference between.
Oh, Robert, we've just lost you. 1 second. Robert, we just lost sound on you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go. Okay, I've got you. Yeah.
So the key difference for me about the understanding of people and the empathy with the people who have suffered and the cultures that have suffered, the difference for me, particularly being someone who spent some time in India in the early 60s, where my father was working, that it is the very nearness and the very Britishness of the Asian understanding of what we did in the colonies and in the empire per se, which is far closer to most people's understanding of what's going on rather than the Americas. And I think our recent history has been coloured by by Hollywood and 12 Years a Slave and everything else. Seems to be, well, that's the Americans' problem. It's not ours. Whereas I think the Black Lives Matter issues and a lot of things that I've learned over even the last 2 or 3 years would say actually there's a hell of a lot of our problem. And of course, we were the transit point for a very large proportion of the people who were transported.
Well, Rob, I agree. And I think the strange thing about this whole process is even when Lara Spirit, my colleague, who's kind of managing the chat and put together the slides that we had at the very beginning of the Thinkin, sent me the slides earlier just to show me the numbers of people and who had shipped the largest numbers of people. The numbers of people shipped by British ships with the British flag on, just absolutely flabbergasted by that. And there is something in this that the more you look at it, the more you're amazed at how little you know and how little this is told. Rob, I'm going to come back to if I might in a moment, but I want to just usually in conversations like this, what I do is I turn to someone and I say, look, we don't know each other very well, so this is quite awkward to put this to you. The truth is with Thomas, I really do know him very, very well, so it's not so difficult. So I want to get at, if you like, the reactionary reaction to your book. You know, Robert said it was a courageous and audacious thing to do. The reality is there are some people who deeply dislike it, right? And part of what they dislike, I think, is at a moment where the UK is in so many ways an uncertain place. They're saying, even if it's not articulated quite like this, which is, don't adopt a guilt or shame. Don't rubbish our history, right? Yes, and by all means, tell our history, but don't tell it with a lens that makes us feel terrible. Because if you do, right, instead of actually listening to you, we're going to wrap ourselves in the Union Jack and pay no attention to what you say. In some ways, actually, we're going to find ourselves more determined to resist the arguments for restitution or reparations. And so I just wondered, Thomas, how you think about that as you're right now navigating some people who are sort of like Robert, kind of saying, thank goodness for you, it's time someone told this story, and a white person telling the story, and other people saying, this is not your story to tell, don't adopt it, or even worse, don't try to direct the traffic of contemporary politics on this. How do you think through those issues?
So, I mean, let me tell you, let me answer it in 2 parts. I mean, the first part is, when it became blindingly obvious, as Chloe was saying about there being massive harm. I mean, the slave trade, over 3 million captive Africans were transported over to the Americas. Over a third died in the Middle Passage. The mortality rates were incredibly high. Terrible conditions. The sexual assaults were horrendous. Families were split up. I mean, this thing is as people have said earlier, a crime against humanity. The harm is pretty obvious. And I started asking myself, well, who's responsible? And it became incredibly uncomfortable, because the more I thought about it, and the more obvious it became. And look, I'm someone who, when they did the census, you know, I would never write white person. You know, I didn't want the government to know my business. You know, I just didn't buy any of that stuff. And the more I looked at it, the more obvious that the people who were responsible primarily for this were white people. And I have to say, when that became obvious to me, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. But the facts are, the vast majority of people involved with transporting the captive Africans were white. The vast majority of the people owning the ships were white. The vast majority of people running the plantations, transporting the commodities to Britain, unpacking those commodities, selling them on the streets, making money on the streets. And the vast majority of the wealth that flowed to Britain benefited white people. Now, look, there were some Africans involved with the slave trade. There were some Black and mixed race people involved with the ships, and a few even were owners of enslaved peoples. But this is a tiny, tiny minority. So the truth is that white people do have a special responsibility, in my view, an additional responsibility. And that was quite a thing when I got my head around that. Well, then what does that mean? Does that mean then I duck the question? I don't talk about it because people are going to be upset by it. You know, as I said earlier, I've spent a few years in Germany, and I think I've been inspired. Look, I don't think you should compare the Holocaust, what happened to Jews in the Holocaust and the other victims, with what happened to the Africans in Britain's role in slavery. However, I think there are some lessons. And what I learned in Germany was this extraordinary, to me, extraordinary responsibility taken by the German government. You have, not only do you have the Holocaust obviously taught in schools, but you have memorialization everywhere. You have education campaigns. You have a very strong commitment to anti-Semitism work, to education work about anti-Semitism. There is a collective acknowledgement about what happened, something which does not exist in this country. So as an example, when people talk about taking down statues, which is not a conversation we need to have today, but when people talk about that, I always say, well, what about Adolf Hitler Platz, the square named after Adolf Hitler in Berlin? Mm-hmm. Well, no one would imagine calling that square Adolf Hitler. So there's a lot to learn, I think, from what's happened in Germany. And I mean, and there are conversations in Germany about, you know, about whether Holocaust education should continue and so on. But I think we can learn a lot.
But Thomas, can I just go through, because of course we talked about this at the time. We talked about it in the naming of the book, and we talked about it in the discussion about the framing of the argument on reparations. And I remember thinking there were, and I'm gonna get this probably wrong, but there were four kind of critiques, if you like, of the central argument around white debt, right? Yeah. One was, as you say, the issue about whiteness, about saying, not that this was a British debt, but this was a specifically white debt, right? That to an extent, you were making this about race today, as much as it had been about race 150 years ago. And there was perpetuating race. Then there was a question around causality, which is that one of the arguments in the book, one of the points that's made in our slides is, look at the life opportunities depending on race in this country today, right? But how much can you reasonably say there's a causality from Demerara in 1823 to, you know, the UK in 2021, right? And a complexity of things in history, and it seems to make that fair. Then there's the issue which I put to Robert, which is who pays the check? If it is a debt, who's actually paying the check? And the fourth was, I think, an issue about practical politics, the recognition that you might be flabbergasted that there's a debate around singing Rule Britannia at the proms, but when you threaten to take that away from people, there are a group of people, not least Boris Johnson's Conservative government, that realizes that actually there's great potential in making the case that Robert made about things that identify us as British: fair play, equality, all of the points that, that Robert made. I mean, and so the combination of all of those things means that this is a very, very, to many people, very oppositional argument that you're making.
Yeah, I mean, the answer, I mean, on the logistics of who pays how much, I mean, these are logistical questions which actually very smart people with a lot of experience who've thought about this a lot, including, as Kibwe said, CARICOM, the Caribbean community. They come up with a 10-point plan. Other people have, there's a plan in Africa. I mean, there are people who have very good plans about this. On the causality, yes, there is. It's a long time ago, but if, you know, when I'm listening, when I'm talking to people in Guyana or Black British people here or African Americans in North America, I am hearing from them that they are still experiencing the legacy of slavery today. You know, and you can see it in the difference in the outcomes and the opportunities, the health outcomes, in the wealth acquisition. It's just everywhere that you can see it. And it is complicated, but doesn't mean it's not true. And yes, there's multiple sources, but doesn't mean that the slavery and the intergenerational traumas and the inequalities that were caused by slavery doesn't exist. You know, in terms of the political context, in terms of it being problematic or difficult or upsetting, I understand that. And I understand there is and I felt it, and the conversations with you, conversation with my publisher, should we call the book White Debt? Should we call it the British debt? Should we call it the sugar debt? In terms of upsetting people. And I thought, and this is where we came to, is let's say it like it is. And maybe we will upset some people, and I think we have. But hopefully it's going to be provocative. And the most important thing is it brings people into the conversation. There aren't any easy answers here. It is complicated, but there are some truths, in terms of the atrocity was called, the harm was called, and there needs to be some accountability. And it's not just about acknowledging. Education is important. Acknowledging is important. This is what I've heard from people. It's education is important, but there needs to be some material outcomes. There needs to be some consequences.
And Thomas, thank you. I'm going to come in a moment, if I can, to my colleague Luke Bedimer and to Paul Atherton, who's been a member of Talks from the start. But I just wanted to go to Cleo, if I might, just before going. Is there something, if you like, kind of sort of naive and wishy-washy about the point I'm making to Thomas, which is you can't bring everyone along. Actually, there has to be a head-on argument about this. How do you see it?
It is difficult to bring everyone along, and I think again it does go back to education, and perhaps some people would be slightly offended by the term white debt because it is quite inflammatory, and maybe it should be, but I think maybe it doesn't. It's a bit of a blanket term because there would have been people who didn't benefit from this legacy. Perhaps they benefited as a kind of consequence, because when we look at places like Bristol, the very fabric of the city was built upon money from enslavement, and so to that extent, many people benefited, but the actual personal or family financial inheritance wouldn't have existed for some people. So I think that should be taken into consideration, and other things when we try to think about how we can bring people with us. I think again, I'm really encouraged the perspective that Thomas has had in his book, reframing language as well to try and make it more empowering for people, and using the term enslaved rather than slave, because many people will just equate slave with someone who's of African descent or a black person, which of course isn't the case. Also, when we think about abolition, it's a process. Abolition wasn't concluded in 1807. It's something that is ongoing, and of course people do look to the US and quite wrongly assume that it was the US who was involved in enslavement and not Britain, also forgetting that many of the foundations of modern America are from the UK. I mean, only a couple of years ago there was the commemoration of the founding of Virginia, and a bit of an argument between Bristol and Plymouth as to who founded it. But it was, essentially white men from the UK. And I think, it's perhaps more obvious to see the legacy in terms of looking at America, in terms of the prison system, and how there's basically just a new form of enslavement you can see after abolition. So the journey continues.
Well, you're right, Cleo. And I should just say, one of the things that I kept on finding myself, I mean, I should say this to you, Thomas, when I read your book, I kept on finding myself kind of tripping over facts that you think this can't be right. And one of the simple ones was to, Robert's point about who's profited from slavery, was that the Gladstone family's reparations, i.e. the money that the British government agreed as part of the settlement to end slave ownership, was equivalent to £80 million.
I mean, when I first saw that, I mean, I found that so, I just couldn't, I found that so unbelievable. I mean,
unbelievable. So, I mean, I think that's the other thing I know that you don't, because you're like deep in the weeds of this, but for newcomers like me, the fact that reparations have been paid, but of course to the slave owners, not. Also,
James, just to jump in there, that, many people got more interested in all of this when in 2015, they realized around 2015, of course, that everyone in the UK as taxpayers was actually still paying back that. And yes. I think it repulsed a lot of people. And some people in the survey we had said, well, sometimes I think that we should leave things in the past. But however, when they learned about that, it kind of reignited them to say, actually, no, this is wrong and something needs to be done about it. We want our tax money back, if nothing else.
You're right. There's a certain kind of stories in there, Cleo, which is like, when you read it, you think, no, they can't be true. Someone's someone's not checked their facts, and then it is. Let me just bring in my colleagues, if I might. Well, my colleague Luke Bedimer, and I want to then bring in Paul Atherton. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Robert, and I've seen a few other hands are up. Luke, there are two things I just want to pick up. You made points in the chat. One was, you making the point right at the beginning about having thought one thing, but having become more jaded. And then maybe possibly in the course of the conversation, feeling a little more uplifted about how you frame it around human rights rather than race. Just so tell me, where do you land on this?
Yeah, so I was thinking about a Thinkin that we did not all that long ago, but still prior to the pandemic. So it's a couple of years now, where I'm conscious of myself coming to this discussion with a very different mindset. And the main change is this. I've seen the continual failure of the language around white debt, white privilege, British privilege, to galvanize the people who do need to be brought closer to reconciliation and to truth and to understanding. I've seen it alienate them. And I think quite clearly about the summer in 2020, going to speak to people who were out to defend Winston Churchill's statue from what they saw as a mob of people protesting in support of Black Lives Matter. And those people, I think that their gateway into this discussion about how we all move forward to a period of time where we respect human rights more fundamentally, we address socioeconomic inequalities at an individual and a community level, where we take on the massive challenges that we face as a civilization, from climate change, recurring pandemics, and anything else, in a way that is fair and decent. Those people need to come with us. And I have so much respect for the activists and artists and writers and people who've been developing the concept of white privilege and the distinctions between Black and white people. But the jadedness is around the specific point of seeing that narrative fail to reach the people who most desperately need to be reached, who are willing to go to Parliament Square and fight police in order to fight Black Lives Matter protesters. But I'd love to hear what Kibwe and everybody else and Robert have to say. I shouldn't have spoken for so long.
No, Luke, I think you're getting at something that is really important and really difficult here, which is how you make sure that you make progress on this rather than just make a point. It's definitely the question, isn't it? Paul Atherton, are you there? Can we hear from you?
Yeah.
How are you?
Good, sir. Alive. You're going to have to excuse the echo. I'm in the London Library, and it's a very old building, so poor lighting and bad echo.
Well, Paul, so tell us what you think on this.
Well, I think I remember all the sort of discussions around the slavery apology back in 2007, and I put some of the notations in the chat there. And I think one of the key things is that I would like to see all of slavery history studied and looked at, rather than just taking one small chunk. You know, you've got the Saharan slave routes that went on for centuries before we sort of arrived. Britain arrived and started the transatlantic slave trade. And then we've got modern slavery today, which is far, far worse than it ever was over that period of time. So I think we go to a dangerous place when we start nitpicking history to make points without actually understanding the evolution of why that thing happened and the consequences of it later. And of course, we talk about abolishing slavery. You know, Instagram is now a slave trading platform. You know, we haven't actually eradicated. What we've done is made it illegal, finally. It was completely and utterly illegal for centuries. But I think that's the real key to it, is if we're going to talk about history, if we're going to talk about the evolution of these things, we look at it in its entire context and not just picking it out in small moments.
Paul, thank you. I just want to go back to Robert, if I might, on both of those points. One is the kind of the full global picture, Robert, that Paul just mentioned, but also, and I'm going to sort of make a mess of the point that Luke was making, but this issue about how you get to a kind of shared conversation around human rights rather than making issues of race even more divisive. And I realize I'm going to kind of stumble into the whole white fragility thing here, but it will be people saying, okay, look, I am white, it's 2021, and I may be an indirect beneficiary of that, which some people wouldn't acknowledge, but even if you acknowledge it, it's not my fault. I wasn't responsible, I wasn't there. How do you end up progressing in this conversation rather than making race even more divisive?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would, let me say two things. Let me begin by quoting that really famous Chicago rapper, Common, when he says, justice is juxtapositioning us. Justice for all is not specific enough. I think he's making a point about the fact that when we try to dilute or distract from the importance of dealing with the history of race and racialized oppression, that we actually obfuscate and miss the point of what we need to really deal with, which is this legacy that continues to haunt us, the way in which race and racial terror has been reconfigured in the modern period, in the contemporary world. So I understand the human rights dimension. Malcolm tried that back in the 1960s. King tried that back in the late 1960s. But I think there's a recognition now that we need to address this issue on its own, although it is intersectional. Black feminist writers will tell us that it cuts across issues of gender and also issues of class as well. So we recognize that's the first thing. Second thing I think it's important to note is that Black scholars have been making this point about the history of slavery for the last 50 years. You know, Orlando Patterson taught at Harvard for 20 years, wrote 3 major books on the history of slavery, looking at slavery across the African continent, transatlantic slave trade. Black people have been making these points. The point of doing this history is to become acquainted with the scholarship and the way in which people have made these connections, you see. So part of the problem is that we know so little about the history, so little about the scholarship, that we actually are limited in our ability to comprehend it and make sense of it. Last point I'd just like to make, throw in a third one, if I can be Pentecostal here, because Pentecostals always add something in at the end. You know, Pentecostal pastor always says, I've just got one more thing, and then he gives you five more things. But first rule of decolonization: allow formerly oppressed people and their descendants to determine the nature of their own liberation. If that offends people, tough. That's the first rule. If it makes people feel fragile, tough. That's the first rule.
But sorry, Robert, that's not the maths problem that I think in some ways the one that I'm trying to figure out. The one of the arguments that Hillary Rodham Clinton was made against Hillary Rodham Clinton about 2016 was, if you try to get together a coalition that is, like the Americans would call, quote unquote, progressive, don't be surprised if there's a coalition that builds up, right? That's as forceful, if not more so, and that's reactionary. And the issue I've got here goes directly to the point you made right at the beginning, which is there's a selective historical amnesia, you said, and to retell that history, to have the acknowledgement that you're talking about, is an assault on ideas of civility, fair play, and equality. So what I'm trying to work out is, how do you get that through a British public square political argument? That's what I want to try and understand.
Yeah, I think we can only learn from history. And I would look at the history of the civil rights movement. When King goes to Atlanta to begin 60, 61, 62, he only has 5 pastors with him. You know, there's never going to be a mass amount of people who are going to stand with you against any kind of racialized oppression. So I don't necessarily believe that you have to take everybody with you. I think you just work with the people who want to push for the agenda and are willing to work with it. And I say that because I'm presupposing, within the best traditions of Black fugitivity, the idea that so long as there is a West and Black people are in the West, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get the kind of racial justice that Black people deserve. So my presupposition leads me to the idea that you're never going to win everybody over. You know, that's the reality of it. However, you may win over some people. So for example, I'm not allowed to say this because I've signed agreements to not say it, but there are major institutions that Black people are working with who want to pay reparation. They don't want to call it that. Yeah. So those of us who have made this point for decades, and look, it's not just me. I was in,
but by the way, Robert,
the Rastas who were saying this in the 60s and 70s. It's a longer history.
So sorry to interrupt you, Robert, but there is something, of course, that we should just sort of pause smile and shake our heads at the thought that you are required by a non-disclosure agreement not to say the institutions that themselves are considering an act that anyone should think is directly engaging with history, arguably the truth. The idea that that's under wraps is a kind of moment to
because they're just they're worried about the political
reputation.
Of
course.
But for those of us who are, as I said before, I'm interested in the check. I want Jamaica's debt paid off. I don't want to see poor people scavenging for food on the rubbish tips in Barbados. I want those debts paid off. So I'm happy to stay quiet if I know they're going to get the check. To be quite honest, so I mean,
there's a whole. I mean, by the way, you know, sometimes when a story walks into your newsroom, the idea of secretive reparations is itself a kind of extraordinary thing to investigate. I would have thought. Forgive me, I'm going to just come back because I've seen a few people whose hands been up for a while. Akim and Claude, Garnet, you've had your hand up from the beginning. I just wondered what you were, how you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yes, so first and foremost, I think what is a big issue is we have to look at our own cabinet and of how representation is really low efficient within government and within high earning jobs. We have barriers within, like myself, I'm still continuing to be out of education because of the colour of my skin and because of my own hidden disabilities. Also, we have to talk about the society of the white world within the authors and within the kind of literacy and also the kind of representation of the Black authors and kind of that, you know, making it very whitewashed, but not also equality and that kind of representation. We also have to talk about the oppression which we still face and of the fact that within STEM, there's a lack of representation when it comes to diversity, when it comes to also inclusivity, when it comes to people of neurodiverse, as I've found there's not much information within the kind of figures, and I know that there's a low number when it comes to Black scientists or Black professions within STEM, and that is very concerning. And then we wonder why we have the issues where they said with the pandemic there was a lack of kind of understanding, and also the kind of figures that they tried to say where it was more highly you know, poignant in the Black community, when if you don't have the representation and if you don't have the kind of, sorry, can you hear me?
No, I can. Forgive me. I'm just aware of the time, Akim Claude, because I want to make sure that those points
I think the main factor is we need equality, we need representation within these areas, and the factor is we're still underneath this oppression, and the fact that even with killing the bill, it's going to also make a struggle and issue for Black Lives Matter or protesters in the fact of speaking about strong topics that need addressing and the issues that need addressing in society.
Thank you very much. I agree, and I want to make sure I put those. Thomas, I'm going to come to you in a moment for the last word on this, but I just want to hear, Keep, where you've got your hand up, and I wondered whether or not you had thoughts given the conversation about reparations that we've had.
Yes, I just wanted to make two comments. One on the check, and one when it comes to how do we deal with an issue that's focused on one particular race and that seem to cause more division. Now, I like to use simple examples. For example, let's put a car, and the car is the society, the world in general. And if the car has a problem, do we just look at one particular problem, or do we try to inspect the car in total to see maybe if the engine is going okay, if the wheels are aired up, if the steering wheel is proper? And what we have to see that the disparities of society, for example, if you have African descent, there's a major disparity there, which is, what should I say, causing the society not to be as equal or to be as progressive as it should be. So I believe that once we try to look at things in that particular way, whereby the different problems that society is generally faced with, that continues to affect society as a whole. When it comes to the whole conversation about the check, I am very fascinated about the check, where it's going to come from, where the fund is going to come from, where it's going to go, etc. But I think the primary case to be built is on a simple acknowledgement that a debt is owed, that there's disparities in today's society, that there was a crime against humanity. Until those specifics, those acknowledgements are being made, there's no conversation about the check. After those conversations, after persons acknowledge that yes, there is a debt to be paid, then we could break off into different caucuses to then finalize or to quantify how it's going to be paid, if it's going to go as checks, if it's going to go to funding, etc., etc. One of the things that we're pushing most, or pushing primarily, is the acceptance that a crime was being done against people of African descent, and a debt is owed. Until the persons who would have benefited from enslavement would have come to grips with that particular notion, and would have agreed to it, and admit, of course, to playing a part, whether you've been a part of it or, what should I say, inherited, of course, because of your ancestors. Then we can really talk about checks and, of course, quantifying it and everything else.
Thank you, Kibwe. Thomas, I'm going to come to you last, because if you have followed your books and your history, and we've often talked about this, that one of the things that you've done in your books is that you've made us realize that history is real. It's not something that's kind of lived in laws and kings and dates. It's lived in the lives of real people, and of course that's true in the Hansson Rudolph story. It was true in The House by the Lake. But if you're also a follower of your writing, you'll know that the line blurs pretty quickly for you between history and activism. Something happens after you write a book, and that happened with, the Alexander House in Glienicke, with The House by the Lake. And I wonder what happens now with white debt. What do you do now that you're engaged in an argument which, as Robert, I think, sort of hinted at the beginning, it wasn't the obvious argument for you to get involved in, but you're in it now. Where do you take it from here?
I mean, yeah, so on a variety of levels, but one thing I am working on, but having these conversations, educating myself, talking with my family about and investigating our own history and thinking about what we can do about it. But also I've been working with David Lammy, Shadow Foreign Secretary, and he's written to Dominic Raab, saying and requesting and making the case for the pardoning of the enslaved abolitionists who took part in the Demerara Uprising, because the British Empire and its role in slavery is unconscionable. But here is a very clear example of how these men and women were, in my eyes, and I think should be in other people's eyes, were heroes. They weren't just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for all of our freedom, including white people. And the idea that they were found guilty, many of them were executed, their heads were cut off and put on pikes as a warning to others. This is something that we could remedy, and I'm totally supportive of David Lammy's campaign to have a royal pardon for these heroes. And I think these people, Jack Gladstone, Kwame, Alma, and the others, need to be honored and respected and remembered for how they contributed to our freedom today.
Yeah. Thomas, thank you. Robert and Chloe, thank you. Thinkin, I probably didn't tee it up properly, but the idea when we started it was essentially like an editorial conference, a newsroom editorial conference. And you can imagine in any newsroom, the question of reparations would get really quite heated quite quickly. I suppose we cheated a little in that 2 years ago, in response to Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing on this subject and the debate on Capitol Hill, we at Tortoise argued that this had to go through Congress and there had to be a US argument. And I suppose, if I'm honest, Thomas, we did it in the way in which many British people often do, thinking that the US has a serious issue with slavery that they need to resolve. And to your point, Robert, kind of indulging in a little bit of UK amnesia. In that context, I think it's obvious that if Tortoise was to take a better informed point of view in the light of this conversation, you say unarguably we have to do a better job of knowing our history at school and university, but culturally too. And actually the argument for engaging in reparations in the way that Kibwe frames them, in ways that are structural, seem incredibly powerful and surely should be examined and debated. And I just come back to the point that Robert made, the one that obviously I found really hard to figure out. How do you unpick civility, fair play, and equality? And I was struck by two things in this conversation that I'll take away. One is that one of the other qualities that I suppose British people pride themselves on is the value of history. It's in everything from Shakespeare to what plays on the BBC, to the way in which we talk about ourselves and our place in the world. And one thing that we can do is say we're a country that learns from our history. And the other thing that strikes me is that we've also been a country that, where other people may find that governments always win cases, we pride ourselves on being a place where the rule of law works. And it was striking listening to almost everyone, Cleo, Robert, Thomas, Kid, where everyone used this point about a crime against humanity. And if we believe in something, it's the rule of law and the application of the rule of law. So I'd be interested to know how we pursue that. And then one final thing, because we're a newsroom and we can't help ourselves, but when a story walks in, Robert, and you hear about efforts by big institutions who are willing to pay reparations, but want to do so without being seen or known for it, I personally think, others might disagree, but I personally think that the more people know about it, the more people will do it, and they will find some comfort and strength in others. So you might think by profession, I'm in favor of transparency, but in this case, more than ever. So I hope that this conversation has done for you what it's done for me, made me think in a whole range of new ways about this issue. I know there's much more to discuss, and I hope in 2022 we'll do more of it. But for this evening, a big thank you to you, Cleo, to you, Robert, and in particular to you, Thomas. Thanks very much. Have a very good evening, everyone. Tomorrow, by the way, we're trying to fix a whole other set of questions. UK politics. Join us to discuss how Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner are getting on with the job. Thanks so much.